All right, this is Thursday's video talking about graphs of sine and cosine functions. With graphs of sine and cosine functions, they're called periodic functions, and those are functions that repeat exactly in regular intervals called cycles. And the length of a cycle is called its period. Okay, and so like for example down here, this is an example of a periodic function because it's going in a regular cycle period. It's going in the same pattern over and over again. Versus this one is not periodic because both my waves and my cycles are all going very sporadic. So you don't know when they're going to stop and start. So this is the type of graph that all of our graphs should look like whenever we're graphing. So sine functions look like this. That's the basic function sine of x. And it starts at 0, 0. The graph is always going to start at 0, 0 unless it's got a transformation done to it. And we'll talk about that too. And then cosine always starts at the top, which will be what its maximum is. And we'll talk about how to find the maximum. Okay? And so we'll be talking about how to graph both of those. And so the domain for sine and cosine functions is all real numbers. And sometimes you'll see it as written as that little fancy R. It's the same thing as all real numbers. Because remember, your domain is your x value, so my graph is just going to keep on going forever and ever left and right in that little periodic function. Versus my range is from -1 is less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to +1. Okay, because my graph goes down to -1, goes up to +1. The only time those numbers change is if we have a different maximum and minimum. So the basic form of a sine function or cosine function, its maximum is always 1, and its minimum is -1. But again, that's going to change when the equation changes. But that's what the actual basic format of a sine and cosine function. It always goes in a smooth curve, and each function cycles through the values over an x interval of 2 pi. The cycle repeats itself indefinitely in both directions of the x-axis, but most of the time we'll just be graphing one cycle. Okay? Now back here is a lot of extra stuff that's kind of crazy, but this right here is super important. I'm talking about the amplitude and what your period is, and we'll talk about how to find those. So your amplitude, so if you notice it says a sine of b of x, your amplitude is always the absolute value of whatever a is. So that number in front of a is always your amplitude, and the amplitude always tells you what your maximum and minimum value is. The period, you always say 2 pi. It's always going to be 2 pi, and you're going to divide it by the b value, which is in front of x. Okay, and so what the period tells you is between 0 and whatever our period is, my graph should make a full wave going in both above and below the x-axis. Okay, and so these are examples of what happens when our graph changes or the equation changes. So like 2 sine of x, it goes all the way up to 2, goes all the way down to -2. So that changes what my maximum minimum value is. Versus these numbers here, when my equation changes to 2x, my graph goes from this to a really small graph because we're dividing by 2, which means my period is going to get smaller. Versus if it's a bigger number dividing by 4, that means my number is going to get even bigger, okay? And it's going to stretch out. So that's not really super important. I'm going to show you how to use that. Don't really stress out about all of this. But on the next page is where we're going to talk about how to find everything. So remember, we want to find what the amplitude and the period is. So the amplitude, you always get from the number in front of sine. So this time, that means my amplitude is equal to 1/2. Okay, which means that my graph, the maximum value will be +1/2, the minimum value will be -1/2. To get your period, that's not exactly your period, but you take your period is equal to 2 pi divided by your b value. Your b value is what's in front of x. Okay, so that means we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by 1/2. And remember, when you divide with a fraction, that means you multiply by the reciprocal. So that turns into 2 pi times 2/1, which is 4 pi. So basically what that 4 pi means is that means between 0 and 4 pi on my graph is going to make a full wave in between that. So this is my period here. Okay? So looking at cosine 1/3 cosine of 2x, my amplitude would be 1/3 because that's the number in front of cosine. And then 2 is what we would use to find our period. So my period, I would take 2 pi and divide it by 2, which gives me just pi. So that means between 0 and pi, my graph should start and stop in the same spot. Okay? This section right here is super duper, uber important. Okay? This will help you with graphing everything. Okay? So again, amplitude is the constant that gives the vertical shrink or stretch. Remember, that means that is my max / min value. Okay, so if it's 3, that means my maximum is +3, my min is -3. And it's always the number in front of sine / cosine. Okay? And then my period, you kind of can't tell what that says, but it's 2 pi over b. And remember, that tells me, and the b value is the number in front of x. And so this interval part tells you to divide your period by 4. So once you get your period, what your interval tells you is how often you should have a point. So say I divided pi by 4, that means I'm going to have a point at every pi over 4. So just like when we graph a point and it was talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, but instead it's going to be pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and so on. Okay? You need 5 points, maximum, minimums, and your intercepts. Now, you always need to know where to start at. Sine always starts at the intercept, or at 0, 0. Versus cosine always starts at the max value. Okay? So, like, for example, we've got 3 cosine of x, okay? My amplitude here is 3 because that's the number in front of cosine, okay? Which means that my maximum is +3 and my minimum is at -3, okay? We always, with cosine, start at our max value. So that means I'm going to be starting at 0, 3, okay? And then our period, and I'll fill out the table here in a minute and explain what all that is. So our period, you take 2 pi and divide it by the number in front of x. Well, this time there is no number in front of x, so it's understood to be a 1. So it's 2 pi over 1, which means my period is 2 pi. So that means between 0 and 2 pi, I should start and end at the same, I should have a full wave, okay? And then to get my interval, I take my period and divide it by 4. Okay? You're always going to divide by 4 to get your interval, okay? And 2 pi over 4, you want to simplify, so that just becomes pi over 2. Letty, stop. Okay? So what happens here is, so this is basically us creating a table to tell us where to start a point. So we always start with our x values with our tables, right? So we're always going to start at 0. And we add by our interval every time. So I'm going to add 0 plus pi over 2, which will just be pi over 2. Then I'm going to add another pi over 2, which will just become 2 pi over 2, which simplifies to just pi. Okay? Then I'm going to add another pi over 2, which gives me 3 pi over 2. And I can't simplify that, so that stays 3 pi over 2. Then I add another pi over 2, which gives me 4 pi over 2. So that that simplifies to 2 pi, which is my period. So that means I know I did the right thing because I started at 0 and I ended at 2 pi. So I know that my points are in the right spot here. Okay, so just to re-go over what I did here is I took my starting point, 0, and I constantly added by my interval every time. And whatever that equaled out to was my next point. But you always simplify if you can. Okay, now with cosine, like I said, you always start with the max. Okay, and it always follows the same pattern every single time. So because it starts at the max, that means my next point is going to be at the intercept, then the minimum, then the intercept, and then back at the maximum. Okay, it always goes max, intercept, min, intercept, max. It's going to create a wave. Okay, and so we said that our maximum was at 3. Our intercepts are always at 0, -3, 0, 3. Okay, so now we can plot our points. So at 0, we're at 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, at pi over 2, I'm at 0. At pi, I'm at -3, 2, 3. At 3 pi over 2, I'm back at 0. And then at 2 pi, I'm back at 3. So now you have a full wave, okay? So it seems like a lot, and I know it's going to take a little bit, but once you keep following the video and following how I do more examples, you'll understand. So basically what we're doing here is we're taking the bits of the equation and helping us fill out our table. So that number out front told me what my maximum and minimum values would be, and then the number in front of x helped me find my period and my intervals so I could find my next x value there, okay? So I'm going to flip over to the next page so I can do another example. All right, so here we have 1/2 sine of 2x. So again, the number in front is always my amplitude. So that means this is 1/2, which means my maximum is at positive 1/2 and my minimum is at negative 1/2. Okay, my period, again, you take 2 pi and divide it by the number in front of x. So that'll be 2, which simplifies to just pi. So that means my period is at pi. So that means, again, between 0 and pi, I should start and end at the same place, okay? Now, because we're talking about sine, sine always starts at the intercept, okay? And to get my interval, we take our period and divide it by 4. Now, I can't simplify pi over 4, so that stays pi over 4. So that every pi over 4, I should have a new point, okay? So we start at 0, and then we add pi over 4. So that's 1 pi over 4. Plus another pi over 4 gives me 2 pi over 4. And 2 pi over 4, 2 over 4 simplifies to 1/2, so that's pi over 2. Plus another pi over 4 gives me 3 pi over 4. And I can't simplify that. Plus another pi over 4 gives me 4 pi over 4, which simplifies to just pi. Okay? So I know I did everything right because I started at 0 and I ended at pi because that's where my period was. So I was constantly adding by pi over 4 every single time, and that gave me my new points, my new x values. Now with sine, because we start at the intercept, that means we go up to our maximum. And then back to our intercept, and then our min, and then back to our intercept. So intercept should be every other point. Okay, so that means that's 0, 1/2, 0, negative 1/2, because that's my minimum, and then back at 0. Okay, so when we graph this, that's at 0, 0 here. That's my first point, 0, 0. Now, pi over 4 isn't exactly given to you on here, but you know, if you notice, it goes 0, pi over 4, then pi over 2. So that means pi over 4 is in between 0 and pi over 2. So at pi over 2, and I'm going to label my axes. This is 1/2 here, and then this is 1. So that way we can see our graph better. Okay, so the first rack's going to be 1/2. That means the first line down here is going to be negative 1/2. Okay, so at pi over 4, which is in between these two, I'm going to be at 1/2. Then at pi over 2, I'm back at 0. Then it says 3 pi over 4, which again is in between these 2 points. So 3 pi over 4 is in the middle, and that's at negative 1/2. And then at pi, I'm back at 0. So now we have a full wave again. Okay? So we started our intercept, then our max is at 1/2, intercept, min, intercept. Okay? Now I'm going to add a little bit extra, which is our shifts. Talking about a phase shift and a vertical shift. So transformations is coming back here. So again, this tells me what my amplitude is. This tells me to do 2 pi over b to get my period. Now the phase shift means my left and my right. Versus my vertical shift tells me my up and my down. Okay? So we're back to transformations all over again. I can already hear you guys groaning now, talking about how much you hate transformations, okay? So remember, a vertical transformation moves the graph up or down. So remember, if it's positive, that means we're going up. If it's negative, that means we're going down. Now, phase shift is a horizontal translation, and the phase shift of h moves the graph. Now remember, if it's positive, that means we're going right. And if it's if it's positive, sorry, got that backwards. If it's positive, we're going left. And if it's negative, we're going right. Okay, so if it's positive, we go left. If it's negative, you go right. So you have to kind of think opposite on that. All right, so we're going to flip over to the next page, and we're going to do a couple of examples. Okay. Now we have the example, sine of x minus pi over 4. Now, I'm going to keep on going just like we've been doing with labeling our max, min, and all of that good stuff, okay? So with my amplitude, notice there's no number in front of sine, so that's understood to be a 1, which means my max is at positive 1, my min is at negative 1, okay? My period, we take 2 pi, and we still divide by the number in front of x, which again, there's nothing there, so that's understood to be a 1, so that's 2 pi. Now, with sine, we always start at our intercept again, okay? And with our interval, again, we take our period, and we always divide by 4, which simplifies to pi over 2. So every pi over 2, I should have a point. Okay? Now, notice here we have this minus pi over 4. That means that my graph, when it says identify the phase shift, that means that we're going right pi over 4, okay? Because it's minus, that means we're going right. So we're going right pi over 4. That means that becomes my new starting point, or my new starting x value, okay? Because we're moving from 0, we're moving right to a positive pi over 4, okay? So that's my starting x value. So that means instead of adding to 0 with our interval, we're going to start by adding by pi over 4 to our interval. Now, some of y'all are going to look at this and say, okay, well, that means I have to add pi over 4 to pi over 2, right? But they don't have common denominators, so that's going to make it harder. But if you look back, before we simplified, we had 2 pi over 4. So we can still use this fraction because they're equal to each other. It's the same thing. So I'm going to add pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4, which is going to give me 3 pi over 4. So that means my new point is 3 pi over 4 plus another 2 pi over 4 is going to give me 5 pi over 4. Plus another 2 would be 7 pi over 4. Plus another 2 would be 9 pi over 4. Okay, so those are my new x values. So nothing changes about my y values here. Whenever it's going left and right, that just changes your starting x value, so you add on to that starting x value. Okay, and again, with sine, we always start at our intercept. So that means my next y value is going to be my max, my intercept, my min, and then back to my intercept. Okay, so my intercept is at 0, then 1, then 0, -1, and then 0. Because your intercepts are always at 0, and then we labeled up here that our max was 1, and our min was -1. So now we can graph it. So my first point is at pi over 4, 0. Now notice again, my points aren't labeled as pi over 4s, but I said before, they're in between points. So pi over 4 is right here in between 0 and pi over 2. All right, so that pi over 4 is at 0. Okay, 3 pi over 4 is at 1. So basically we're going in between the points here. 5 pi over 4 is back at 0. 7 pi over 4 is at -1. And then 9 pi over 4 is back at 0. So we have a big old wave right here. Okay, so now we've got it all graphed out, and we're done on that one. Okay, I know this can be confusing, this type of stuff. You normally takes just a lot of practice. You really have to get used to making the table and finding everything, and then you can find all of your answers. All right, I'm going to flip over to the next page. So this time I have 3 cosine of 2x plus 2, okay? My amplitude is 3. my max, now here's where we have to be careful, okay? I'm going to come back to the max and min because this plus 2 at the end tells me to go up 2, right? So that means my max would have been 3, but because I have to move it up 2, that means my max is now 5, okay? Now because we did 3 plus 2 to give us 5. Now my minimum would have been at -3, but because we have to go up 2, that means we have to add 2 there. So that's going to become -1. So that's my new max and min. So that's what changes whenever you're given a vertical shift up and down. So the plus 2 at the end tells you to change what your maximum minimum value is going to be. Changes nothing to your x's, okay? So my period, we take 2 pi and divide it by the number in front of x, which is 2, which gives us pi. And because it's cosine, we're going to start at our max. And our interval, we take our period and divide it by 4. And I can't simplify pi over 4, so we're good there. That every pi over 4, I should have a point. Okay, so between 0 and pi, I should make a full wave. Okay, so we're going to start at 0. We're going to add by our interval every time. Plus pi over 4, which is pi over 4, plus another pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4, which simplifies to pi over 2, plus another pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4, plus another pi over 4 gives me 4 pi over 4, which simplifies to just pi. Okay. And with cosine, we started our max. Okay. And then we go to our intercept, and then our min, and then back to our intercept, and then back to our max. Okay. Now we said our max was 5. And our intercept, now normally my intercept would be at 0, but again, because we moved our graph up, that means my intercept is now at 2, because my 0 got changed to 0 plus 2, which is 2. Okay, my min is at -1, intercept is at 2, and my max, I don't know why I wrote mix, max is at 5. Okay, so at 0, I'm at 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to run off the graph a little bit. Okay, at pi over 4, again, we said that's in between the points. We're at 2, so 1, 2. At pi over 2, I'm at -1. At 3 pi over 4, I'm back at 2. And then at pi, I'm back at 5. So we got a full wave going on there. Okay. So if you look back at the previous problem, if it's left and right, it's going to change what your starting x value is. That's the only thing that changes. And if it's your going up and down, it changes what your max and min and your intercepts are going to be. Okay? Now for my next example, and our last problem, I think this was our last problem. Yeah. For our last problem, we have -2 sine of x. Now, this time we have a negative out front. The negative tells me there's a reflection. Okay, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, our amplitude is 2. Your amplitude will never be a negative. Okay, it's always positive. So that means my max is at +2, my min is at -2. Okay, my period, we take 2 pi and divide it by the number in front of x, which is 1. So that's just 2 pi. So between 0 and 2 pi, I should start and stop in the same spot. Okay. My interval, we take 2 pi and divide it by 4, which is going to become pi over 2. And with sine, we always start at our intercept. So remember, sine is always at your intercept. Cosine always starts at the maximum. So you got to make sure you're starting in the right place when you graph these points. Okay. So with sine, we start at our intercept, but normally we would go up to our max. But because it got reflected, that means we're going to go down to our minimum. Then we go to our intercept, then our max, and then our intercept. So it kind of flips its way around. Okay? So, and again, to get our points, that's 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi. Oops, just pi. Plus another pi over 2 would be 3 pi over 2, and then 4 pi over 2, which simplifies to 2 pi. So we set our intercept is at 0, minimum is at -2, 0, 2, 0. So we start at 0, 0. Pi over 2, I'm at -2. Pi, I'm at 0. 3 pi over 2, I'm back up at 2. And at 2 pi, I'm back in my intercept. So we made a full wave there. Okay, so like I said, this is complicated, and you're probably going to, and I hate having to teach this via video, but we don't really have a choice on this. But all it is just following what you're told. And in your classwork, it's not going to give you to fill out every single part. You're going to have to fill out some pieces on your own and understand, find those things so you can fill out your own table. And I highly suggest whenever you graph on your classwork to actually make a table for yourself, because once you make a table, all it becomes is plotting the points once you've got what you need. Okay, so that was the notes for that. Yeah, that was all the notes. So for your classwork on here, you're just telling me what the amplitude and the period of each function is. Okay, ignore this where it says to write the period in both radian and degree. I don't care about that. Okay, so you just tell me what the amplitude and the period is. Remember, your amplitude nor your period should ever be negative. So even though there's some negatives written in here, that doesn't change anything. Okay, numbers 7 through 10, you're not going to write the equation. You're just going to tell me what the amplitude and the period are of each one. So like for example, number 7, my amplitude, remember your amplitude tells you your max and min. So my amplitude is at 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So that means my amplitude is 3 because my max is at 3, my min is at -3. Now your period is when you start a full wave. Always start at the intercept of your x and y axis, and you want to make a full wave. So we want to make a full wave up and then back down, and wherever you stop after you make that full wave is your period. So I stopped at pi, so my period is pi. Okay? And then down here, if you picked up the paper from the copiers at the school, I know the graphs suck, but you're just going to have to deal with it. I want you to graph, so I want you to practice what we just did in our notes as far as graphing the actual functions themselves. Okay? I highly suggest you make a table for yourself, so that way you can know where to start, where to stop, where each point should be at, and all of that good stuff. Okay? On the back side, you're graphing some more up here. Okay? Make sure you pay attention to any reflections or transformations or anything like that. Okay? Down here, you're telling me what the amplitude, the period, your phase shift, and your vertical shift are. Okay? So amplitude, I want what A is, I want your P is, I want what your phase shift is, and I want what your vertical shift is. Okay? So that should be 4 answers. If they don't have one of those, like say for example it doesn't have a vertical shift, then just put NA or none. Okay, so there should be 4 answers for 17 through 20. Number 21, you're graphing with your transformation. So it's practice on your transformations again. Ignore the fact that this one is out front. It's the same thing as having a +1 at the end over here. Okay, so you're going to graph it. It's got some vertical and some horizontal shifts in it. You're just practicing what you've been doing up until this point. Okay. Oh, actually, I'll do one of them with you. I'm going to do one. I'm going to do number 21 with you. I'll do number 21. Okay? Because this has got a combination of the two, so I'll just do an example with you. Okay? So, my amplitude is 3. My period, remember you take 2 pi and divide it by 2, which will just give me pi. So that means between 0 and pi, I should start and stop in the same spot. But we're going to have a phase shift. Okay? And then we'll talk about our interval first. So interval, you take your period and divide it by 4. So that becomes pi over 4. Every pi over 4, you should have a new point. Now, Remember, this negative x minus 2 means that my graph is moving right pi over 2, and this plus 1 at the end tells me up 1, right? So that means that's going to change both my x's and my y's. So we're going to make a table here, just like we did in our notes. So our x and our y, and then I'll label the max, min, and all that, okay? So remember, the right pi over 2 means that that's starting at pi over 2, all right? And we need to add by pi over 4 every time. Now, that gets confusing because they have different bottoms, okay? If I'm going to take pi over 2 and I want to add by pi over 4, I need to give them common denominators, right? So the way to do that is I need to give this one the same denominator as that one, okay? So in order to turn 2 into 4, I multiply by 2. So that means that's going to become 2 pi over 4. And we're going to add that to pi over 4. So this is what we're adding every time. I just changed our starting point to a common denominator, okay? So 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 gives me 3 pi over 4, plus another one is 4 pi over 4, which would be just pi, plus another pi over 4 would be 5 pi over 4, plus another pi over 4 would be 6 pi over 4, which simplifies to 3 pi over 2, okay? You always need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. If you're not sure where to start and stop, you always should have 5 points. Now remember, now we start labeling our max and min. And so this is sine, so that means we started our intercept, and then our max, and then our intercept, then our min, and then back at our intercept, okay? So, but because we're starting at, we have this plus 1 at the end, that means my intercept has moved from 0 to 1. My max has gone from 3 to 4. 1. My min has gone from negative 3 to negative 2 because we're going up 1. And my intercept is back at 1. So at pi over 2, which is kind of hard to read these, but pi over 2, I'm at 1. At 3 pi over 4, which is in between pi over 2 and pi, I'm at 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. At pi, I'm at 1. At 5 pi over 4, I'm at negative 2. And at 3 pi over 2, I'm at 1. Then you have a full wave. Okay, so that was a combination of both a shift, a vertical shift, and a phase shift. So remember, the phase shift moved my first starting point to whatever the phase shift was, okay, or the opposite of it. So notice this was negative, it turned it to positive. And then the vertical shift here told me to change what my intercept and my max and min. And just to go back over how I got each one of these x's, I turned my starting point into a common denominator. So because they both needed a 4 on the bottom, I multiplied by 2 on the top and the bottom. So pi over 2 is 2 pi over 4. They're both the same thing. Okay, and then I added pi over 4 every time. So 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 gave me 3. Plus another one gave me 4, plus another one gave me 5, plus another one gave me 6, and I just simplified the fraction as I went. Okay? And then on the next page of your classwork, you're just graphing some more, okay? Notice I already, if you picked it up from the copier or whatever, the domain and range is already crossed out. I don't want that. All I want is amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift, and the actual graph itself, okay? Make sure you're graphing it. I'm not going to give you credit unless you graph it, and then unless you answer all the questions. Make sure you start in the correct place. Just because it says theta, don't freak out. It's the same thing as x. You can change that to sine of 2x if you want. Same thing. And again, if there is no phase shift or no vertical shift, just say NA or none. That's fine. Okay? I crossed out number 4 for you. You don't have to do that one. You're welcome. Number 5, you're practicing. This is got some more transformations. I crossed out 6 for you. And then 7 and 8's got some more transformations for you. But it's only got 1, so you're good. You don't have to worry about a combination of 2. You only had to do that one time. Okay, so that's Thursday's classwork. Now, Friday, there is no video because I just want you to practice some more on graphing your sine and cosine graph. So on this page, this is Friday's classwork, okay? You've got, I want you to graph the function. Now notice the axes aren't labeled, so you can label them however way you want. If you have an interval of pi over 4, label every tick mark by a pi over 4 instead of having to go in between tick marks or whatever, okay? So you're gonna tell me what's that period, the amplitude. If there's a reflection, all you gotta do is say yes or no if there's a reflection. Phase shift and vertical shift. And the transformations is the same thing as that. You're going to tell me left, right, up, down, and reflection. And then if there isn't one, just say NA or none, okay? And then you're going to actually graph the function. So you're graphing these, and they're a mixture between sine and cosine. And there's some transformations written in here too. Okay, so you're going to graph all of those. And then same thing on the next page of your classwork, okay? So that's Friday's classwork. I want that turned in as well. So again, just like I said on Wednesday's video, okay, take a picture of your classwork and your answers and all of that, okay? So what I want you to do is whenever you're doing these assignments, you can, if you've already got it printed out, that's great. Just write on the sheet and then take a picture of it and upload it into your Google Classroom, and I'll grade it through there. If you do not have it printed out for yourself, then you're just going to have to, honestly, you're going to have to write it out yourself as far as the problems and on a separate sheet of paper, okay? If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can email me at mitchb, M-I-T-C-H-E-B, @gcsnc.com. You can message me on Remind, or you can comment on the videos or in Google Classroom. Please let me know if you have any questions. I really want to be there as much as I possibly can, okay? All right. I miss y'all. I'll talk to you tomorrow on the next video.